on a most challenging theme, challenging fundamentalism, Islam, modernity, and human rights. My name is John Whitty. I am Director of the Law and Religion Program here at Emory University, which is one of the two co-sponsors of this afternoon's event. The Law and Religion Program is designed to explore the religious dimensions of law, the legal dimensions of religion, and the interaction of legal and religious ideas and institutions. The program is predicated on the belief that religion gives law its spirit and inspires its adherence to ritual, tradition, and justice. Law, in turn, gives religion its structure and encourages its devotion to order, organization, and orthodoxy. Law and religion share such ideas as fault, obligation, and covenant, and such methods as ethics, rhetoric, and textual interpretation. Law and religion also balance each other by counterposing justice and mercy, rule and equity, discipline and love. And this dialectical interaction gives these two spheres and two sciences their vitality and their strength. Organized in 1982, the Law and Religion program provides students, staff, and faculty alike with unique forms and forums of interdisciplinary and interreligious study, specialty courses and clinics, projects and publications, colloquia and conferences, lectures, and panel discussions such as this one. The program thereby seeks to cultivate integrated forms of knowledge and holistic understandings of the meanings of the legal and religious professions. We are privileged to have the Department of Religion and Emory College as a co-sponsor of today's event. The faculty, staff, and students of the Department of Religion have been faithful collaborators with the Law and Religion program from the very start, and we appreciate this most recent expression of alliance and reliance by them and with them. The new department chairman, Professor Richard Martin, was kind enough to agree to serve as chair of the panel discussion today. Professor Martin comes with impeccable qualifications for this august role. He is not only professor and chair of the Department of Religion of Emory College, he is also professor of West and South Asian religions in the Graduate Division of Religion. He holds the PhD from New York University. He has taught at Arizona State, Iowa State, Stanford, Princeton University, and American University in Cairo. He has lectured throughout the world on Islamic topics, notably in North America, South Africa, the Middle East, Pakistan, Malaysia, and Indonesia. He is the author of numerous articles and several books on relevant themes in Islam, including two very recent studies, Islamic Studies, A History of Religion's Approach, published this year by Prentice Hall, and a forthcoming title, Defenders of Reason. It is with great pleasure that I welcome to the lectern Professor Richard Martin, who will chair this afternoon's panel discussion. Professor Martin.
Thank you for that stunning introduction, John. He asked me to write it, of course, and so I got to say some good things about myself. And I want to say right now that I want to anticipate that there could be some conflict on the panel this afternoon. We have two panelists, one who is trained at the University of Cambridge in England, and the other from the University of Oxford. And insofar as there's competition between the two, we might hear about it. This is the first of two programs that will be sponsored by the Law and Religion program and the Department of Religion in the college, dealing with these topics of Islam and modernity and the kind of conflicts that these produce and the ways in which these are being negotiated. The second one will be advertised later on. I thought for those of you who are obviously interested in the topic, I would announce that on December 2nd, on Monday, at the same time, 3 o'clock, in room 102 in Whitehall, there will be another panel featuring Professor Hassan Hanafi from the Department of Philosophy at Cairo University, and Professor Ibrahim Musa from the Department of Religious Studies at Cape Town University, talking about Islam and postmodernism. So the discourse will continue. I think you all know that the media, and I think to a certain extent academe, have focused a great deal on the topic of fundamentalism. And more fundamentalism, a term that was used very widely for religious movements in the teens of this century in this country and in Great Britain, has come to be focused on the topic of Islam. And so it's important, I think, that we all know that there is a discourse going on in the Islamic intellectual world that is not simply just challenging fundamentalism, but that in a sense fundamentalism has to be seen as existing in a much wider, more dynamic intellectual response to the challenges of modernity and change in the West and a number of topics that I'm sure will come up by our speakers later today. So we have a real treat today to be able to not only hear about fundamentalism, but to see, to hear from persons who are thinking through the alternatives. And I want to suggest that the press is not right. A great deal more is going on in this regard, but we simply don't hear about it. I'm going to introduce all three speakers, the two featured speakers and the respondent, and then let them speak in turn. And the ground rules will be that the two main speakers will have about 20 minutes to make their presentations, followed by Professor An-Naim, who will make about a 10-minute response. Following his response, perhaps the two main speakers may want to make a brief reply, and then it will be open for discussion from the floor. Let me begin with Professor Nasser Hamid Rizk Abuzaid, who received the BA and the MA with high honors from the Kulliyat al-Adab, the Faculty of Letters at Cairo University. A few years later, he earned the PhD with highest honors from the same faculty and was immediately offered a position on that faculty. He has also studied at the American University in Cairo, held a fellowship for the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at University of Pennsylvania, served as visiting professor at Osaka University in Japan, and since 1995, he has been visiting professor at Leiden University in the Netherlands. That was the same year he was promoted to full professor at his alma mater, Cairo University. Ustaz Nasr Abuzaid has written 12 books in Arabic and as many articles on the field of hermeneutics and the concept of Islamic textuality, very interested in particular in the problems of interpretation. The earlier books included such topics as rationalism in exegesis, the philosophy of hermeneutics, all of these are in translation, and the concept of the text, the study of Quranic sciences. It was with his works appearing in and after 1995 that we began to have such titles as Criticism of Islamic Discourse, Women in the Discourse of Crisis, and Caliphism and the Authority of the People, that Professor Nasr Abuzaid became the target of extreme criticism by the Islamiyin and traditionalist Muslim groups. The second speaker, Noraini Uthman, received her early education in traditional schools in Malaysia. Later, she earned the MPhil degree from the University of Hull, and then after that, the MLit degree from Oxford University. Currently, she is a candidate for the Dr. DPhil degree in the Faculty of Social Studies, Wolfson College, Oxford University. And she is also, at the same time, on the faculty at the University of Kebangsaan, Malaysia, in the Department of Anthropology and Sociology. Ustaza Noraini has written and taught courses on the application of the Sharia to the modern world with respect to such issues as gender and family law. And she has undertaken this research also within the discourse of the social sciences. In addition to several articles and chapters in books, she has edited a work titled Sharia Law in the Modern Nation State, a Malaysian Symposium, and edited with Celia Sun Chim a book titled Gender, Culture, and Religion, Equal Before God, Unequal Before Man. This year, Ms. Othman is visiting Emry University as a fellow in the Law and Religion program and the Carnegie Council of Ethics and International Affairs in New York, both under a Fulbright Islamic Studies scholarship. Ms. Uthman has lectured, spoken on panels, and participated in workshops on topics related to the topics I just mentioned, dealing with Islam and modernity in general around the world. And we're indeed very fortunate also to have her with us to a portion of this semester and on this panel. Responding to these two distinguished guests is a person who probably needs no introduction, but that's what I was hired to do. So I'll say a word or two about my good friend Abdullahi Anaim, who was born and received his early education in the Sudan. Most of his advanced education has been in Great Britain, except for the LLB degree, one of two LLB degrees, which he received from the University of Khartoum. That degree and a second LLB degree from the University of Cambridge he received with honors. Then the PhD at the University of Edinburgh with a dissertation on the comparative pretrial criminal procedure, where he compared English, Scottish, American, and Sudanese law. Indeed, much of his work has been very comparative in focus. And we can also say that that comparison has focused in particular on issues of human rights in international law. He served with Human Rights Watch, the African desk in Washington, D.C., 93 to 95. He's taught at the universities of Khartoum in the Sudan, UCLA School of Law, the College of Law at the University of Saskatchewan, the Faculty of Law at Uppsala University, Sweden, and now is Professor of Law and a Fellow of the Religion and Law program here at Emry. He's the author of several books, and has edited others, including a book titled Toward an Islamic Reformation, Civil Liberties, Human Rights, and International Law, and has edited a volume titled Human Rights in the Cross-Cultural Perspective, Quest for Consensus, 1992. In the latter work, he contributed an essay in which he argued that Muslim participation in international human rights must be based not on values imposed from modern non-Muslim sources or movements, but rather the task is to bring international legal and ethical issues such as human rights into dialogue with traditional Muslim texts and sources. I will turn the program over now to the two speakers and the respondent, and we'll begin with you, Professor Nasr Abuzaid.
Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Well, it has been a lot said about fundamentalism and modernity. But anyway, I would like today to introduce some elements of modernity within the original message of Islam itself, and with Islamic thought, classical Islamic thought, and modern Islamic thought, in order to explain why it is now under protest from recent Islamist or fundamentalist discourse. Modernity has been lately identified as the modern industrial and urban way of life, which stands for a specifically Western set of notions that took roots in the 18th century. Modernism was also identified as the movement in arts and literature and which aims to capture the essence of that way of life. Modernity entails a new periodization of history, ancient, medieval, modern, in which the modern denotes the period when reason and science triumphed over scripture, tradition, and custom. At the heart of modernity is the notion of the free acting, free knowing individual whose experience can penetrate the secrets of nature and whose work with other individuals can make a new and better world. This definition does not mean to deny that some sorts of modernity did exist before modern history, or that it is limited to Western way of life. Modernity, however, is not a universal conception, as long as it has been always related to and shaped by time and space. What was considered to be modern in a specific time and place turned in the course of history to be classical or even old-fashioned. This is true in literature, art, music, philosophy, and ideas, etc. This fact makes it very possible to speak about modernity, or rather modernities, in classical Islamic thought. It is even very appropriate to speak about the kind of modernity Islam brought to the world in the 7th century, and explain how this modernity was carried out and developed by Muslims till the 12th century. As it seems nowadays that Muslims are very reluctant to accept contemporary modernity on the grounds that most of its values contradict Islamic values, or that they rather stem from human legislation, while Islamic values are originated in divine revelation. It is important here to deal with this contemporary conflict in the context of the intellectual history of Islam. Islam, in its historical and social context, was meant to introduce a solution to the critical socio-historical situation of the world, as represented by the situation in the Arab Peninsula. The world was divided into two conflicting powers, the Roman and the Persian empires. The Arab Peninsula was controlled at its north boundaries by two semi-Arabic states, each of which was affiliated to one of the two great powers. The major aim of these states was to keep the Arabs inside the peninsula boundaries in order to avoid any threat to the boundaries of the two empires. Being forced to depend completely on their internal primitive sources of life, the Arab tribes gradually started entering into severe bloody conflict over the water sources. In order not to completely destroy human life and to keep trade traffic going, they agreed to stop fighting for 3 months every year. This was the sacred months, recognized and respected by Islam. In this context, Islam can be looked at as a new system of belief, ethics, and social order that was meant to change the life of the Arabs in order to enable them to solve the critical situation in which they were trapped. On the level of belief, Islam presented the notion of one transcendent God to replace the tribal deities, the idols, in order to free the individual from worshipping his own hand creation. On social order, the community of believers was created to substitute the social tribal order. On the level of ethics, individual rational conduct was supposed to be the norm instead of the absolute commitment to tribalism which Islam labeled as Jahiliyyah. Social justice was introduced in the form of obligatory alms giving and the repeated command to treat fairly the slaves. On the intellectual level, Islam insisted on opening the gate for free thinking and argued for rational reflection and condemned blind following of tradition or copying the past. In addition to all the new teachings, Islam integrated to its own system most of the social and religious institutions founded before its emergence, like Hajj, pilgrimage to Mecca, and Kaaba, which was the house of idols but became the house of God. The mosque, not the Kaaba, which was the tribe leaders' meeting place, during ندوة, the mosque became gradually the Muslim Congress place. As for history, Islam reconstructed all the oral narratives of antiquities in order to put its message as the higher, final, and most complete of the serial of God messages to mankind since the creation of the universe. Though Islam considers itself as the last Abrahamic religion, criticism of the existing scriptures of both Judaism and Christianity was emphasized in order to integrate their followers to the Muslim community. In brief, Islam was not meant to be only an ideology of understanding or explaining the world or a mere spiritual conviction, but it gradually emphasized, in addition to that, its nature as an ideology to change the world. The fact that the Quran, the divine revelation of God, recorded some of the battles between the Romans and the Persians, expressing its sympathy with the Romans' defeat, testifies to that nature. It did not take long after the death of the Prophet before Muslims started their great invasion of the world. But right after the announcement of the Prophet's death, a heated debate took place between the people of Mecca, the Muhajirin or immigrants, and the people of Medina, the Ansar or supporters of the Prophet. This debate was about the successorship issue. A serious conflict arose between the two groups, which was about to turn into violence. But an agreement was reached by choosing the oldest person, Abu Bakr, who happened to be the Prophet's father-in-law as the first Khalifa. Nevertheless, the issue of Khalifism turned to be a major political issue, especially during the era of civil war known as Fitna, which created three political parties with three different opinions concerning this issue. One group of Muslims, the Shi'is, which proved to be a minority, believed that the Prophet had in fact designated his successor, and that was his son-in-law and cousin, Ali. Another group, which formed the majority of Muslims, the Sunnis, took the view that the Prophet had deliberately left the question of his succession open, leaving it to the community to decide who would be the most competent person to assume its leadership. But they emphasized that caliphate should be only confined to the Meccan aristocracy, Quraysh, the Prophet's tribe. The third major political trend in early Islam was the rejection of both the Sunni and the Shia position. And its follower came to be appropriately known as the Khawarij, plural of Khariji, meaning an outsider. Allied to their uncompromising attachment to the Quran was a democratic temper, insisting on the right of all Muslims, irrespective of their tribal, racial, and class distinction, to elect or to dispose or to be elected as ruler. As the Khawarij started to support their political position by quoting some verses of the Quran, Islamic theology started to emerge, and the Quran, or rather the interpretation and the counter-interpretation, became to be at the heart of it. Depending on the Quranic text declaration that it includes clear verses, ayatul muhkamat, which are the backbone of the book, and ambiguous verses, ayatul mutashabihat, which should be interpreted in accordance with the clear ones. Quran was the site of a fierce intellectual and political battle. That battle was cited at one of the most important junctures of the structure of the Quranic text. All schools of Islamic theology agreed on the principle, but they disagreed when it comes to practical implementation. The controversy does not only revolve around the meaning of the Quran, but it also involves its structure. What was considered clear by one school was considered by their opponents ambiguous, and vice versa. Concerning this specific issue of the meaning of the holy text, it could be said that Islamic theology was mainly divided into two trends: the trend of literal interpretation and that of allegorical or metaphorical understanding. The struggle between these two trends was, in fact, and still is, a struggle of modernity or against it. In this context, the Mu'tazilites movement, which is the very rational movement, appeared in the 2nd century, which is the 8th century. Just to illustrate the most important ideological features of the Mu'tazilite movement, the following could be said. One, it did not start as an intellectual exercise, but was intimately connected to socio-political situation at the time. That is the rise of the Abbasid against the Umayyads. The idea of God's predestination, Jabr or Qadr, was the theological expression of Umayyad absolute political rule. The Mu'tazilites' insistence on man's free will, or at least on the illegitimacy of making God responsible for human sin, was politically an anti-Umayyad stand. Second, they had to defend Islam against other religion. To be accepted, their argument had to be rationally sound, hence their interest in Aristotelian laws of logic, at their time the methodological standard of international philosophical speculation. The Mu'tazilites' confidence in the power of human reason to attain knowledge was based on Aristotelian thought. The rationality of their discourse implied, furthermore, that there could be no discrimination on ethnic, social, or sexual ground. Third, the Mu'tazilite theory of the relation between man, language, and holy text was most rationalistic one. It concentrates on man as the addressee of the text and the one to whom its teaching was directed. They drew from the Quranic text on the assumption that it was a created action, not the eternal verbal utterance of God. This concept implies that the relation between the signifier and the signified in language exists only by human convention, that there is nothing divine in this relationship. The endeavor to build a bridge between the divine word and human reason. This is why they insisted that the divine word was a fact which adjusted itself to human language in order to achieve welfare for mankind. They insisted that language was a product of man and that the divine word respected the rules and forms of human language. Fourth, they used the conception of metaphor as used in human verbal communication to interpret the ambiguous verses of the Quran. This forged a powerful instrument to interpret the Quranic text according to the Mu'tazilites' transcendentalist standard. The Quranic text, where it suited their ideas, were interpreted as non-metaphorical, clear. Where it did not, it was considered to be ambiguous, metaphorical. The major principles of the Mu'tazilite theology are, first, knowledge starts from this world. We can only speak about the other non-seen world on indications furnished by the evident reality of this seen world. God and his attributes can only be known by reflection and acquired knowledge, not by direct or necessarily revealed knowledge. The well-known philosophical allegory of Ibn Tufayl, Hayy ibn Aqdan, is a very good illustration. The second principle is that all mankind, regardless of race, color, religion, language, or culture, is equally provided by the necessary imperative knowledge called necessary intellect. They differ, however, in their capability to move by act of reflection from the level of necessary knowledge to the level of acquired one. This act of reflection implies even deduction or induction, which means examining evidence and indications. Thirdly, knowing God is a duty imposed by God. It is a religious duty. It is the absolute objective of intellectual reflection to know God. God provided man of intellect, which is the necessary knowledge that enables a man to reflect in order to acquire true knowledge about God independently of the divine revelation. Fourth, no contradiction between rational acquired knowledge and divine revelation. Rational theology is a permanent attempt to make a synthesis between the data of human intellect and those of the Islamic revelation. In the case of any apparent contradiction, the data of revelation have to be interpreted according to the conclusion of human reflection. Metaphor, allegory, or other figures of speech are means of interpretation. Then comes the critical aspect of the ideology of this group against their opponent who restrict themselves to the literal interpretation of religion. First, critical knowledge is needed, not following tradition. Traditionalism, according to the Mu'tazilites, is uncritical adherence to the doctrine of a school and all its traditions. This criticism of traditionalism is obviously directed to the Orthodox school of theology, which defended the literal interpretation of all the Quranic expressions to the extent that they affirm the existential reality of all God's attributes, all of eschatological images, even of the fact that God will be seen by human eyes. Traditionalism and accordingly literal interpretation of the holy text is not a religious duty according to the Mu'tazilites. It is even a failing in fulfilling of those duties. God himself has imposed it as a duty on mankind to acquire real knowledge which cannot be reached by uncritical adherence to tradition. As a matter of fact, traditionalism includes the philosophy of errors, because there are only two possibilities. Either one follows all traditions, no matter how contradictory they are, or one makes a choice and accepts some tradition while rejecting other. But if one makes a choice, one can never be sure to have made the good one, because no criterion is possible. Even God himself does not demand blind adherence to his message. He proves it by argument and by miracles. The last principle is to reject the idea of consensus or the opinion of the majority, because it is not evidently true. For example, the Mu'tazilites would argue, Muhammad's followers were a small minority in the beginning. Nevertheless, their conviction is true. Claiming the authority of traditionalism to justify traditionalism leads to an endless series of errors. Neither the authority of the majority nor the authority of other traditionalism can guarantee the correctness of following the tradition. From Mu'tazilism, Averroes, the great Muslim philosopher, whose Arabic book, in addition to his translation and commentary on Aristotle's books, contributed to Western enlightenment, he developed the Mu'tazilite system in order to open the meaning of the text to include the findings of philosophy. The Quran, according to Averroes, includes the three modes of linguistic semantic expressions. The first and most common is the outward poetic, khatabi level, addressing the mass. The second is the argumentative, jadali level, intended to address the theologians. And third, the highest one, is the philosophical, burhani level for philosophers. All this was finalized by the project of Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi, who tried his best to integrate all the knowledge of his time to the Quran and to Islam. And then this trend of thought was not carried on because the political interference which tried to enforce some of the Mu'tazilites' idea, and later on a reaction came from a political force. Al-Ma'mun tried to enforce the idea of the Quran on other ulama and persecuted some ulama for that. And later on came Al-Mutawakkil, and he forced the Hanbali ideology against the Mu'tazili ideology, and the Hanbali ideology became the true belief from the 9th century. In modern history, the relationship between the Islamic world and Europe was a relationship of challenge and counter-challenge. The first challenge, imposed by the European invasion of the Arabic world at the beginning of the 19th century, created a reaction leaning mainly towards accepting modernity in order to fight against the European political aggression. The intellectual reaction was essentially similar to the political one. The intellectual phase of that challenge came about in the second half of the same century, in the middle of the process of modernization, which collapsed in Egypt with the occupation in 1882. The intellectual response was to defend Islam and Islamic culture against some Orientalists who simply ascribed backwardness to Islam itself rather than to social, economical, political, and cultural circumstances. With this second phase of challenge, Islam was identified as not only a nationality, but as the authentic characteristics of the collective self, as opposed to the other European. Nevertheless, Islam had to be explained and interpreted as a religion which encourages progress, maintains rationality and scientific knowledge, and accepts modern institutions. The second challenge came with the abolishment of the caliphate in Turkey, which opened a third phase of intellectual reaction to that challenge. And I think I have to explain that there was two decisions. The Kemalists make two different decisions. The first decision was to separate the sultanates from the caliphate. And this decision was accepted and celebrated in the Muslim world, especially in Egypt. But when it came to abolish the caliphate system, then the whole reaction was against this decision. I think Muslims at that time felt that they was robbed of their symbolic unity. In this atmosphere of reaction to the abolishment of Caliphate, Muslim Brotherhood Society was announced by Hassan al-Banna as a reformist movement to bring the whole society back to the track of Islam. And this was definitely the opposite reaction to the European intellectual challenge, for which the answer was, Islam is not the reason of our backwardness, simply because Muslims left Islam behind, and they need to be re-Islamized. So we have two reactions. The first one was to open the meaning of Islam, and the second one was to re-Islamize the whole society. Al-Banna was inspired by Hanbalis, the most conservative school of theology, emphasizing the literal meaning of the text and opposing any kind of rational explanation of the ambiguous verses. This system of theology was ideologized by Ibn Hanbal, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who dreamed of the establishment of a theocratic state in which he would be the juridical advisor. In 1744, he could win Muhammad ibn Saud, Prince of Dir'iyya at that time, to his cause, and they swore an oath of mutual loyalty, bay'ah, to strive, by force if necessary, to make the kingdom of God's word prevail. This pact, which was always faithfully adhered to, marked the true beginning of the Wahhabi state, which trans-instituted theocracy. Muslim Brotherhood Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin in Egypt could be dealt with as an Egyptian copy of the Wahhabi Ikhwan movement. It was, first of all, a direct reaction to the Mustafa Kemal abolition of the caliphate, which was followed by a major literal religious scandal about a book written by an Azhari cleric about الإسلام وأصول الحكم, Islam and the principles of political ruling. Rashid Rida, Muhammad Rashid Rida, Hassan al-Banna inspirer, and a disciple and co-editor of the tafsir of Manar with Muhammad Abdu, was involved in this dispute against Abdul Raziq. He emphasized the religious necessity, wujub, of caliphate to Muslim, to the extent that living without it is returning back to paganism, jahiliyyah. Secondly, contrary to his professor Abdu, who mostly adopted the rationalized Islamic trend of thought, Rashid Rida distinguished himself as a follower of the Hanbali school, as was developed by both Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim. As a reactionary movement, the re-establishment of caliphate was at the top of Muslim Brotherhood agenda. In other words, it was the making of God's word kingdom. The Quran is its constitution, and jihad is the means to make it true. The recent development came about after the 1967 defeat, Arabs' defeat in the war against Israel, which indicated the absolute failure of all the ideologies of 1952 in Egypt revolution, and initiated the fourth phase of problematic Islam and modernity. The success of the Iranian Revolution against the Shah added more confidence to the slogan, Islam is the solution. The two Gulf Wars, especially the Desert Storm, with the Arab-Israeli conflict unsolved, even within so many peace accords, support the public negative tendency towards not only the political West, but against modernity as a Western invention. Part of the discourse of the so-called Islamists, mainly of those who enjoyed learning and living for some period in the West, concentrate on criticizing all the values of modernity because they were the product of anti-religion epistemology. As has been illustrated, the debate, which turned recently to be a war, involves mainly two trends of thought. One of them believes in Islam as an open religion, not only of tolerance, but of deep respect to the others, while the other trend insists on religion, which need to be protected against conspiring enemies. Since the West is the enemy, protection against modernism is necessary. As for the first trend, a distinction should be made between the political West and the human modern values accumulated through the course of human history and reached the Western culture. What has been labeled as fundamentalism in the Western media and in some academic circles is in fact nothing but reactionist movements against all social, economical, and political corruptions in Muslim countries, lifting the flag of Islam as a promising utopia. But the explanation of Islam adopted by the intellectual representatives of these movements is almost the very conservative interpretation dressed in political tone. If it were really fundamentalism, usuliyya, a new, fresh interpretation of the fundamental text of Islam, the Quran, and the authentic tradition of the Prophet would have been introduced. And I think the solution is to open the gate again to reinterpretation of the text. But this is an issue which might take a long time. Thank you very much.
with this excellent philosophical and historical background to the subject matter by Professor Nasr Abuzaid. We now turn to Noaini Uthman, who I presume will talk to the same issues from a more contemporary and social science perspective. Noaini?
First, my heartfelt thanks to both the Law and Religion program and the Department of Religion for providing this wonderful opportunity to talk about some of my work and in such good company. It has been always my role to be a complement. I compliment Nasir Hamid Abuzaid not only in terms of gender, but also in terms of the talk that I'm going to give today. He looks at the historical formative past, the Islamic, the Muslim formative past of the time of the Prophet and the Caliphate. I'm going to look at the present. He talks about the text, I will speak about the context. He had talked about the noetics of Islam, I will speak about the politics of Islamization in contemporary Muslim society. And with that sort of outline, the other thing that I would like to mention is that I shall draw my examples, particularly from the Southeast Asian context, mainly from the Malaysian case, as well as to some large extent, to some degree, the Indonesian. But some of the things which I'm going to outline today about Malaysia or about Indonesia in the context of the advocacy of human rights, or in the context of women's rights movement, Muslim women's rights movement, seeking a bigger, wider political space and political role to play in their society. It will, I think, those things still apply to many of the Southeast Asian countries, to many of the other Muslim countries. And in addition, to add to the complementarity between the yin and the yang of Noaini and Nasir Hamid Abuzaid, he comes from the heartland of Islam. I come from what have been, until recently, I believe, the periphery of the Islamic world. So perhaps in our discussion, we can look at all those dynamics. Now, I take Malaysia as my example because Malaysia has in recent years, particularly in the last 5 years, half a decade or so, not only in the context of the regional politics, but as well as in the context of international relations in the Muslim world, its international relationship with other Muslim countries. Malaysia has been widely proposed, not only by proud Muslim and our most proud Prime Minister, Dr. Mahathir, and his equally arrogant Deputy Prime Minister, a friend, sometimes a friend of mine, sometimes an enemy, Dato' Anwar Ibrahim. Not only by them, but Malaysia has also been proposed as an example by others from elsewhere, so from South Africa, and particularly in the worldwide ummah of the other Muslim countries. Malaysia has been proposed as a possible developmental model for other Muslim societies and nations. Now, whether Malaysia can serve as such model for others, whether its achievements can be replicated elsewhere, and whether those so-called achievements merit the exemplary status that some people propose for it, need not be discussed today. We'll take another seminar discussion. But in that context too, partly because of this accelerated change, I'm sure some of you are quite familiar with Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia, the so-called mini dragons economy of East Asia. Now, Malaysia has been able to maintain in the last 10 years, just at the end, just after the worldwide recession of mid-80s of 1985 to 86, Malaysia has maintained a phenomenal economic growth. It has maintained this last few years an annual growth of at least of 8%. In the early years of 1990s, even up to 9.8, even claimed by our local economists at some stage at 10% per annum. So partly because of this accelerated change in Malaysia, she is seen as one example, not only as a general model of development for perhaps other Muslim countries or predominantly Muslim nations, but she has also been proposed as a possible model for the contribution, for the role of women, for the status of women. Because Malaysia comes from a Southeast Asian context, which historically, in terms of its culture and kinship background, has been less patriarchal in nature. If anything, quite a certain region, a certain part in Malaysia, for example, in the state of Negeri Sembilan, which is quite close in terms of geographical proximity to that part of Indonesia, matriarchy and matrilineality has been one of the historical cultural and kinship system. And so there has not been that patriarchal tendencies, at least historically. When Islam came to Malaysia, it came in sometime around 15th century, in the year 1400. It came through the Sufi traders via India. And at the same time, immediately following that, we have various phases of colonization period, first from the Portuguese, then the Dutch, and then the British. And Islam developed under that historical rubric. And that development in itself have provided its own unique character and its model. So there are very important questions today that we need to ask about human rights, about Islam. And I will now look at just certain issues to do with women's rights specifically, and the advocacy of human rights in the context of the challenge of fundamentalism, not only in Malaysia, but it always also get manifested from the so-called fundamentalist movement from the rest of the world. And the context that we must remember, the two phenomena, the concomitant, always happening at the same time, are the two processes of pursuing Islamic reactualization, particularly under the pressure of various forms of Islamization in all Muslim countries, and at the same time pursuing socio-cultural modernity that has been a feature mainly brought out by the economic transformation. So the economic and cultural transformation, and particularly now the globalization of the economy, has placed Malaysia in this particular position, and perhaps by looking at it, we may draw some lessons or examples for the rest of the Muslim world. Now, when we talk about women's rights, I think in the discussion we can bring that out, and I will have my two very good supporters here who will, I'm sure, vouch a number of my interpretation or my questioning of the traditional interpretation about gender equality and women's rights that were endowed within the text, within the Quran, and or that has evolved, have gradually evolved and changed throughout the Islamic history up till the modern times. I've always proposed to women's group whenever I speak to them that the basic question we should ask. There are about, I said, 5 questions, but let's look at the 2 big ones. I said, the first question is the situation of Muslim women, particularly in the Southeast Asian world, in the Nusantara, in the Malay world, is the situation different or better compared to Muslim women in other countries? Now, is the actual situation, status, and social position of Malaysian Muslim women, both in the public and domestic realms, changing? That's the second question. Third, how is it changing? Is it improving? Or are we facing new difficulties and problems? And fourth, how do the effects of modernization and at the same time that of an increasing assertion of an intolerant and moralistic Islamization had been played out on the issue of the role and status of Muslim women? And finally, which is an important question, from the case study of the Malay world, such as Malaysia, parts of Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines, we should look and we should ask the question, is the struggle for the rights of Muslim women under the influence of both Islamization and modernization? So what can we say about the future and the role of religion, particularly in public life? Now, out of the 5 questions, the 2 questions are quite important and will be addressed here. The rest, I think, will come out in our discussion. Now, these are big. I know these are big and important questions and cannot be tackled in great detail here, especially within the constraint of time of 20 minutes. But I'm going to explain why the 2 questions, looking at the actual situation of Muslim women in the so-called Islamic world, in the Nusantara, in the Malay world, and looking at their struggle, how effective and what will be the outcome, what is the prospect for that struggle. These 2 questions are primary because we have to actually look at the practice and reactualization of Islamic teachings into everyday life, reactualization of Islamic teachings into law, whether personal, public, or criminal laws, and it also at the same time forces Muslim societies, Muslim countries, people in Muslim countries like Malaysia and Indonesia to look back, to reinterpret customs and tradition. So the sociological questions of Islamization and modernity can be confrontational, but at the everyday pragmatic level, most of them have been negotiated depending on the politics of the time and depending on who rules in the context of the state or the particular country. To answer the first question about the situation of Muslim women in the Malay world, it can be said, as I mentioned earlier, that comparatively to the Muslim heartlands, we've had a better experience. Historically, there had not been interpretations. When Islam was brought in, it has been colored by custom and tradition. And therefore, in the legal system, in the Sharia system that has been introduced and particularly consolidated during the British colonial times, have tried to be quite open and have been consolidated and have been written down into legal codes based on the various juristic schools. In fact, using the principle of siyasah sharia, which means choosing particular juristic school and trying to combine and finding a compromise. Now, we were lucky in this tradition because just between the two world wars of the First World War and the Second World War, Malaysia and Indonesia too have been influenced by the modernist movement that Professor Abuzaid mentioned of Taha Hussein and Rashid Rida in Egypt. And so when the British consolidate and spread its rule, although they always applied the principle of divide and rule in the context of Islamic law, even though it has the British common law as the main set of laws, it has consolidated, it has rationalized some of these laws, and the kind of people, the architects, the legal scholars that they have given the task they came from that modernist school and were informed by that modernist spirit. Now the problem comes in the 80s, particularly after the Great Revolution in Iran. And it also came through young sets of people, young Malaysians, young Indonesians, Muslims who went to study overseas. No matter whether they went to study in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Tunisia, or in the so-called Western infidel countries of United States, England, which both of us went to, and came back intact, I hope, with our faith still strong, and other countries. What they have brought is, there is this worldwide movement of Islamization brought by predominantly carrying the influence of the Wahhabi. And I think Yusuf Shuhairi has has analyzed this phenomenon quite well in his book. And so we have people who are in limbo, young Muslims who had been brought up in a more open, at least particularly in the Malay context, in the Malay world context, a more open tradition, in a more open system of Islamic education and Islamic socialization, and then they were fed with these ideas of it is crucial and the identity of your state, your country is not Islamic enough unless we introduce Islamic laws, or we introduce an Islamic state. So this is where the sociologist in me, as well as sometimes I must remind you as well that when I speak, I don't know when the academic begins and when the activist or the advocate of women's rights and human rights begin to come in, but I will always speak with those two voices, I believe. So this is the problem. And I think from that sociological point of view, there are two things that we must always remember, which I think popular media, particularly the Western press, have neglected, that there are two main problems and obstacles to the kind of modernity, to the kind of transformation that's taking place, and at such a rapid pace in such Muslim countries as Malaysia, Indonesia, and parts of Thailand. One is a problem and socio-political. the socio-political problem and obstacles to democracy and democratization. I point out to the experience of colonization. I'm not making any apology for colonization. I'm making a point of fact that colonization also produced what Malik Ben Nabi, an Algerian scholar in the 1920s, writing in the 1920s and 30s, called colonizability, this affliction of the Muslim mind, of being passive, of being dominated by alien ideas, of receiving alien ideas without any critical attitude towards it. And then in the post-colonial time is a question of nation building in the face of great economic and cultural transformations as well as challenges. There's a problem of uneven development regionally as well as ethnically, sometimes also by class, and there's always the problem pockets of poverty, illiteracy, and therefore giving rise to this one big problem which I've always spoken about in Malaysia, the problem of education and intellectual culture in the contemporary Muslim world. I don't need to dwell in great detail on that. Two books by Bassam Tibi, one of it is called The Islam and the Crisis of Modernity, I think have made such pertinent analysis on these things. But this is where what Professor Abuzaid has said becomes quite relevant. Now, in the context of post-colonialism, post-colonizability, with the awareness that we must now find our own roots, re-actualize our authentic Islamic identity within the various movement and politics of Islamic resurgence, whether it has an international connection or whether it is particularly locally based in the Malay world of Indonesia and Malaysia, what you find is that there is always this gap, this perpetual gap. The gap between the experience of a culture of modernity, between the elites, the upper classes, and to some extent in a fast-growing economy like Malaysia and Indonesia, the middle classes on the one hand, and the general populace in the rural areas and in the countryside. Their understanding of Islam, of religion, are quite different. In fact, I'm now currently involved in a government-funded study looking at the new middle class in Malaysia. So what we find in most of our sociological survey findings is that there is a strong reassertion of the need to know Islam. And therefore, middle-class parents always encourage and take their children to religious school. And this is where the problem is maintained. The kind of religious education that are still applied, that are still implemented in all schools, regardless whether it's Malaysia or Indonesia, and I believe still in Egypt. It is still traditional in form, it utilizes rote learning, it's the hafal of the Quran rather than understanding the Quran. And part of the problem is when such groups as some of the human rights group and women's groups such as in which I belong, when we make a public suggestion and advocacy that there should be a reformation of the curriculum of the kind of Islamic teaching within this religious school, there will be an uproar because it touches on the nerve of who has the legitimate power, who is the legitimate party to be teaching these ideas. And so we have this invisible yet very important problem again in most Muslim countries. There is always this claim that there is no church, no cleric in Islam, but in terms of everyday politics, in terms of making changes, such as I mentioned, they've played a role stronger than historically what Vatican City has done. In fact, in my public talk, even over the electronic media, I've always gave a nickname to, we have a center called the Islamic Studies Center. I call that's our version of the Vatican City that we are re-actualizing since we missed that gap in history of having the Dark Age. So, oh, it's been taped, but it's fine. So there is this need for educational reform in religious education. So those are just a brief outline of the so-called problematics, of the complexities of the situation. Such groups of people like myself and Professor Abuzaid and a host of young Muslims all over the Muslim world are facing. Now, I would like to close this presentation by bringing up two ideas which I've been working on or reading in a comparative kind of a perspective with Western scholars. I will never, for the politics of the work that I'm doing in Malaysia, I would always refer Western scholars of other faith, not non-Muslim or un-Islamic. And this is a question of religion in the modern world, because modernity ultimately means a space for individuals in terms of a freedom and rights, a space for socio-political existence with dignity. Now, in the Western world, particularly here in the USA, the primacy of liberalism as a public philosophy is an accepted fact. Now, this is the liberalism that asserts the priority of individual rights over the common good. The liberalism that insists that government should be neutral among competing conceptions of the good life in order to respect persons as free and independent selves capable of choosing their own ends. Now, I'm quoting this from a recent book by Michael Sandel, Democracy's Discontent, America in Search of a Public Philosophy, where he outlines some of the various problematic problems of the kind of public philosophy that has grown out in America, and that it doesn't provide this gap for a kind of a sense of civic virtue, what he calls a sense of civic virtue. He said, the cure for what ails American democracy, according to Sandel, is a pluralist version of the civic politics, the dispersion of sovereignty and a revitalized citizenship formed across multiple sites of civic engagement. Now, modernity for Asian cultures, particularly for Southeast Asian Muslim cultures, such as the Malay world, Indonesia and Malaysia, it always means a balancing of both worlds, of traditional values and things that comes from the insistence of the modern economy, from the modern market, and particularly now with globalization. So it brings now me back to the question of this historical experience of the West of private and public religion. The historical experience that has been captured in academic discourse and political theories about secularization of society and privatization of religion. It is a crucial question for a Muslim country such as Malaysia, particularly in the context of modernity, because you cannot deny that there is a public role that religion wants to play. And historically, within our tradition, religious values, belief system, values from the belief system always assert itself to play a public role. So that is the challenge for modernist movement in Muslim countries in the context of the challenge provided by the fundamentalist movement. Now, coming back to the issue of women in Islam, women's rights in a Muslim society and state, a large part of it consists of questioning the traditional interpretation from both foundational texts, from the Quran, and more often I find in my experience from the Hadith, from the traditions of the Prophet. Now, that kind of confrontation, that kind of negotiation is all the more difficult given the social background, given the conditions that I've explained, and particularly in the continuing very traditional system of Islamic education that has been maintained. In our discussion, we shall dwell. I'm sure there are a number of female Muslim students here who would like to ask specific questions of the work of my group recently advertised. I don't know whether it would be for good or for worse by the New York Times in our work to change, to make some legal reforms within the country of Malaysia. Now, the other problem is the law itself, legal reform. Now, if I mentioned about the more open and the less patriarchal interpretation, but we have a backlash. We have almost a turnaround since the mid-80s with the forces of Islamization coming into the various political parties and even invading the current Dr. Mahathir's party of UMNO. There is not much difference between the Islamists in the government party in Malaysia and that in the opposition, the so-called fundamentalist party, the Partai Islam Malaysia. They actually come from the same formation. They are traditional scholars, ulama, trained within Azhar, trained in Medina, going through the same system, traditional system of jurisprudential learning, of interpretation of text. And they are gaining ground within the government as well as within the opposition. And this is where the challenge of human rights movement, human rights advocates, the importance of coming to terms of rethinking, of authenticating democratic ideas within our own tradition. And the challenge of democracy here also touches upon the question of pluralism. There are two kinds of two dimensions of pluralism that I would like to mention here. The internal pluralism, that is how within Muslim society itself pluralism is managed, often reflects how Islam, or to be accurate, how religious authority in a Muslim state tolerates and copes with the pluralistic worldviews and interpretations about Islam and its legal principles. In this case, we find Muslim society have a lot of problem with pluralism, for it never allows particularly Muslim women, to play a part in contributing their perspective and interpretation of religious texts, and which hinge upon the whole question of interpretation that Abuzaid mentioned in his talk. And finally, secondly, external pluralism. And this is important for a multi-ethnic country like Malaysia. I don't know whether I mentioned it, but 51% of the population in Malaysia is only Muslim, and the rest are people of other faith. External pluralism is how Muslim deals or interact with difference and or non-Muslims as the other. Here too, women are sometimes regarded no differently as the non-Muslim other. I submit that until or unless we Muslims learn to accept difference, embrace difference and the other on an equal and humanitarian basis, then and only then can we claim that we truly practice the Islamic concept of peaceful coexistence and social justice that abound within the discourse of the formative Islam. Now, this peaceful coexistence, a shared notion of social justice, is one which does not violate the rights and entitlements of others, fellow citizens with whom we Muslims must live, and people whom we must accept as equal members of the human race, the fitrah of Allah, created by the one God, Allah, entitled as we are to be treated with equal human dignity and rights, regardless of gender and religion. Thank you.
Professor Noraini Uthman's remarks have brought us to this topic now of human rights, and it's an appropriate time to ask Professor Abdullahi An-Naim from Emri to respond and perhaps set the stage for the discussion that follows.
Thank you. Abdullah An-Naim from Sudan and Emri. I'm also a Muslim from Sudan, very much engaged in the same issues, and somewhat playing a devil's advocate's role, as discussants are supposed to do. I start by wondering about the fact that we are here convened as a panel, the three of us, although I don't think that most of us, or rather that this panel can be convened in most Muslim countries today, all the way from Malaysia to Egypt to Sudan to North Africa. So the point, therefore, is, Professor Abuzaid and Noraini, challenging fundamentalism. Where can we do that? Can we do it here in Emri's sort of intellectual, not ivory tower, but at least the security and the insularity of intellectual discourse and academic discourse, or does it have to be done on the ground, in the field, in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East? And there, the point I put to the two speakers to reflect on is the role that this discourse is having in creating the constituencies and challenging fundamentalism among its own following. Because we cannot deny that fundamentalism is attractive and effective in mobilizing mass following in various Muslim countries. And how to penetrate, how to diffuse that political appeal is maybe something that we need to reflect on, and I will keep my remarks to a minimum so that they can react to the two of them. The two speakers can react to my questions. Second question is the question of modernity and value systems, that modernity is not value-free, is in fact value-loaded. And therefore, whether looking at Professor Abuzeid's opening remarks about a definition of modernity that will allow us to look at classical Islamic thought as a manifestation of modernity, is modernity as we know it today, that the meaning that comes to mind, a Western value-loaded concept, or is it a human value-loaded concept that all humanity can subscribe to? And if it is, how is it defined in those inclusive universal terms? As a human rights person, my sort of inclination was also to look for more emphasis on human rights as an end as well as a means. That as a struggle to create the space for human rights to be respected, as well as respecting human rights in the process of creating that space. And my comment about the location and composition of the panel is very much to do with the paradox of how we need to have human rights in order to have human rights protected. How we need to have the ability to challenge and the means to challenge. The ideas, I don't doubt the power of ideas, but my concern is the actual political space to do so. In particular, my question to Professor Abuzeid is the significance of the classical rationalism that he referred to as a means of re-injecting a level of rationality and secular discourse in the present Muslim political and intellectual discourse. The Mu'tazilites have been discredited for having opted for or being allowing themselves to have been co-opted by political power some 1,000 years ago almost. And it is tragic that we have seen the co-optation going on, and that the Mu'tazilites' theology and methodology is no longer in the consciousness of Muslim masses and even Muslim intellectuals. So the question is how to bring that back up again. Second question to Professor Abuzeid specifically is what Nuraini referred to as the public role of religion. Granted that as a Muslim feminist, which is a point that I would put to her, she acknowledges that there is a need for a public role for religion. How can that public role for religion be without its being overtly political? That is, how can religion have a role in the public sphere without being hegemonic and controlling of the public sphere? To Nuraini, a couple of points specifically. In fact, when we advertised this conference and introduced her as a Muslim feminist, we received some calls from people who said, that's a contradiction in terms. How can be a Muslim feminist? So I would invite her to clarify how she sees her role as a Muslim feminist. Especially relevant, I think, also is the center-periphery dynamics that she referred to. The point being, Nuraini, that the centrality of the history of the Middle East in the foundation, theological, intellectual, and otherwise of Islam, that Islam and the Middle East are seen to be synonymous. Being Arab and being Muslim seem to be synonymous. The Quran is revealed in Arabic. It can only be recited in Arabic. How can we break the center-periphery dynamic without creating a sort of revolution or reformation that would dispel the Arabic hegemony on the imagination of Muslims? In other words, how to clarify the Islamic from the historical experience of the Middle East. For people in Southeast Asia whose language is not Arabic, how can they relate to the text and understand it even devotionally in prayer without understanding what they are reading, which happens to be in a language that they never learn in their lives? Thank you very much.
At this point, let me ask if Professor Abuzaid and Noaini, if you would bring your microphones forward and perhaps conduct the discussion now from the table. Ustaz Abuzaid, would you like to begin?
I would like Noaini to begin.
All right.
The idea that she is a complement.
Yes, he wants to be a modern Muslim man, let the woman go first. The term feminist, that's a label that we don't put to ourselves. I'm speaking as a member of this group of women called Sis Forum Malaysia, otherwise more popularly known as Sisters in Islam. In fact, the name Sisters in Islam was a name given to us by our local media when we first went into the printed media to have a debate with several religious authorities, with some ulama over the move to change polygamy laws in Malaysia. We have, within the context of that legal Islamic Sharia law that we have up till 1984, it encouraged polygamy by putting 4 conditions, including getting explicit permission from the first wife, or if so happen the person is already polygamous, existing wives. And this is where what has happened was that some Muslim Malay men have been quite enterprising and taking the thumbprint of their first wife while she's asleep and saying, my wife cannot write or sign her name, so this is her thumbprint, and make a photocopy of her identity card and says she gave explicit permission. But going back to the question of feminism, it's a label given to us by both the media and the Western media, the local media and Western media who came to interview us and who also asked for us to speak our mind on issues to do with female circumcision and whatever the hot issue of the day in the region at that time. It's also a label given to us by the fundamentalists, particularly the religious ulama who refuse to deal with our discussion, with the ideas we propose. We look at the text of the actual Sharia law that's part of the Sharia law in Malaysia. We also, what we've been doing since 1984 is form this study group. We meet every Monday and we produce some little booklets challenging the various interpretation of Quranic injunctions and the inferences to hadith literature that always form the background of the Sharia, the legal interpretation. So instead of answering, instead of dealing with our message, with our question, the ulama call us, oh, these Western educated feminists, they have been influenced by the West. But seriously, in my talk to Muslim women, particularly Muslim women who are members of the Islamic Party, I've been reckless enough to have accepted that invitation and to give a talk to the Muslim group of women. And whenever there are things that I say which the Muslim male do not agree, there will be a whole row of young men at the back and they will stand up and say, Allahu Akbar, to quiet me down, to silence me. And I say, yes, Allah is great, and I do not disagree with that. But I've always said feminism is not an alien tradition, practice in Islamic history. I said, insofar if you define feminism as the struggle to give equality to women, to give certain rights, and I always point out to the Sunnah of the Prophet in the context of he is one of the earliest persons in history to actually allow Muslim women to inherit property, to dispose of property. And I said, so in a sense, he is what I would call a proxy feminist, a pro-feminist. But his perspective has always been very gradualist, trying to make changes according to the context. And this is where, in our discussion last night over dinner, Professor Abuzaid and I will talk about these 2 texts that we have to deal with. There are those Quranic injunctions that explicitly mention equality, gender equality, and in fact in his last sermon, he actually mentioned women and men are like garments to each other.